Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. This is the 13th annual Pat Reif Memorial Lecture that is supported by the School of the Arts and Humanities and primarily the Women's Studies and Religion department at CGU. And we are also supported by the School of Theology here at CST. So I want to welcome you all and thank you all for coming. I don't have a lot of anything prepared. We're not quite sure where Tammy is, but she's been with our Coptic Pope all day, so she's probably still with him. So I'm sort of filling in for her. And what I want to do is just welcome you, and we've got a few words from one of the members of the Pat Reif Committee who knew Pat, and will tell you a little bit about who she was and why this lecture series was funded. Okay, so what I'd like to do is introduce Ann Heyman, who's going to say a few words about Pat Reif.
All right, good evening. Oh my gosh, I know some of you. This is wonderful. We're friends. All right. Can you hear me? Well, make up your mind. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Well, I am indeed Ann Heyman, and it's lovely to be here tonight. I can't believe that it's been 13 years. It just doesn't seem possible. But anyway, I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces, so some of you have already heard probably what I have to say tonight, but I guess it bears some repeating. It was 1982, and I was 2 years into a ministry funded by the Presbyterian Church called the Mary Magdalene Project, which was a program for, well, they were prostitutes back then, not today, but they were then. And I was floundering, I was struggling. Much of what I read, much of what people told me about prostitution and the women that I was working with and their children did not ring true to my experience. And I was commiserating with my dear friend Bear Ride. No. Actually, she was Bear Scott back then. But anyway, Bear Ride. And she happened to mention to me that Pat Reif was going to start a program in feminist spirituality at Immaculate Heart College. And it just struck a chord with me. So Bear and I made an appointment to come and see Pat. And sure enough, she was going to start a program. The format for it was phenomenal. We were going to meet on the weekends. We were going to sit at the feet of the burgeoning feminist spirituality community, Rosemary Radford Ruther, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, Mary Hunt. I mean, the list just went on and on and on. And I couldn't sign up fast enough. And indeed, it was an incredible experience. And of course, once you've been exposed to Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza and her hermeneutic of suspicion, your life is never the same again. And so, and of course, Pat Reif was just phenomenal. What a woman. To come all the way from being, was it Sister Richard? To the director of this program in feminist spirituality. Can you imagine what kind of a transition that must have taken? And of course, she was a bit of a burr, I guess we could say, in the side of the Catholic hierarchy, perhaps. I'm trying to be nice about this, but anyway, she was, and that endeared her to me. I can assure you that, although I'm Presbyterian, it was lovely to see her kind of just take all of that stuff on and survive, thrive even in the process. She really did. Wonderful sense of justice Pat had. And she loved to play tennis. And I remember she would take cigarette breaks, smoke breaks. When the program first started, you'd find her in the alley someplace or out the parking lot. And by the time I matriculated 10 years later, when she made me quit the program, made me leave, made me graduate, that she had stopped smoking, and she always told me it was one of the hardest things she had ever done in her life. And I thought, you've gone from being Sister Richard to being this phenomenal feminist and to stop smoking was the hardest thing you ever did. My goodness. She was a phenomenal woman, and we're going to see a video in a minute that is a bit more about her and her life and some of the things. She got herself arrested. Hey, yes, good stuff. And you'll hear more from some of her friends about who she was and what made her tick. It's a terrific video, and I hope you'll enjoy it. Thank you.
Seamless person in terms of her work and her life.
So Pat has been, for me, one of the most important influences in my life.
Pat Reif, of course, is an old friend of mine. I know her back from when she was teaching at a college in the 60s.
She was a great friend and mentor and a wonderful colleague in the field of feminist studies and religion.
She embodied excellence in everything she did.
She had just been a woman ahead of her time.
Of having her as a college professor in philosophy and having not had a lot of exposure to such topic, except in English to some extent. I was very, she stretched your mind. She would never let you stay on your work. You had to go to another level.
Pat was one of those inveterate organizers who was always able to find a way, whether it was to get resources together, to raise money, to bring people together. And she was a very, very important person.
Impelled by hope and a growing sense of anger at the bonds of injustice. Like prophets before her, Pat worked tirelessly all of her life to loosen those bonds of injustice.
Long before it was popular to be with the farm workers and the people who were immigrants in California, long before it was popular to be on the picket line or to be opposing a war here or there that the U.S. was waging, Pat Reif was there.
When you work for poverty, you're also working for peace.
Okay. So what is Pat Reif's legacy in women's studies? Pat Reif was particularly invested, she was the dean of that program on women's studies, feminist spirituality. And that was a very important program. She headed that. I don't remember now how many years, but certainly a number of years. And I used to teach for that. So I would come out from, I guess, Chicago was where I was at that point, and I would give, let's say, weekend intensive or something like that. And I think it was a very important program because many, many people went through it. They were really shaped by that program for an ongoing career in issues about women and social justice. So I think that program of feminist spirituality and all the people who went through it and who carried on that legacy in their own lives is her major legacy in that area.
Pat was tireless in her work for that program. She came to visit me at Water to look at bibliography and to talk about the kinds of people who would be useful as mentors and professors in that.
The feminist spirituality program was the outgrowth of a major conversion to feminism that Pat had experienced. The material was no longer just an intellectual discipline. Now it was a matter of life and death for women. She had suddenly understood the connection between the patriarchal system and the oppression of women and many men and the earth itself. And it was her mission to undo the patriarchal system. Getting equal pay for equal work, etc. It was about having a broad enough perspective so that one is aware that everyone suffers in a patriarchal system and that any oppression is immoral. I know that this was made possible in large part because of Pat's efforts early on in the Women's Ordination Conference. These women are part of her legacy.
Actually, I have a very sad memory, but it's a very poignant one and very touching. I stayed with Pat a few times here when she moved in Gilbert Place. And then I was teaching up at the GTU in Berkeley when I heard that she began to suffer from this illness, which of course really brought her life to an end all too swiftly. And at one point I called her up, we were talking over the phone, and she said to me in such a kind of poignant voice, something like, "I'm just not ready to leave this beautiful world." And so I just remembered her voice. I can almost hear it in my head, her voice saying that. I'm just not ready to leave this beautiful world. And that was a very poignant moment that I think about when I think about Pat Reif.
We honor you, our most beloved sister, for a race well run to the end. And in the midst of our sorrow at your loss, we trust that although you are not where you were before, you are now wherever we are.
Grace Gao. I'm faculty here at CST, and I also co-direct the Center for Sexuality, Gender, and Religion, which is one of the co-sponsors of tonight's event. It is my great honor and privilege to introduce to you Dr. Margaret Farley. She's the Gilbert L. Stark Professor Emerita of Christian Ethics at Yale Divinity School. She's been retired officially since 2007, having moved through the ranks from her start there as a lecturer in 1971. So from our lunchtime conversation, I take it she has not slowed down with her very busy speaking, writing, and consulting schedule ever since. Dr. Farley also received her MPhil and Ph.D. degrees in ethics from Yale University, in the Religious Studies department. In the gap between her Yale diplomas and her study of English literature and philosophy at the University of Detroit for her BA and MA degrees, respectively, Dr. Farley undertook the long 7+ years process of becoming a Sister of Mercy. Professor Farley's scholarly expertise includes the following: the history of theological ethics, feminist ethics, sexual ethics, medical ethics, and responses to the AIDS pandemic in Africa. As an academic whose work has real-world implications, unfortunately that's not true for all of us, she was a founding member of the Yale New Haven Hospital's Bioethics Committee. She co-directed the Yale Interdisciplinary Bioethics Center for 9 years, and also previously served as the director for the Yale Divinity School's Women Initiative, Gender, Faith, and Response to HIV/AIDS in Africa. Dr. Farley's honors and awards are legion. I'll just name a few. She is the recipient of 14 honorary degrees, the John Courtney Morey Award for Excellence in Theology, a Henry Luce Fellowship in Theology, and a U.S. Department of State Foreign Service Institute Award. She has been elected president by her peers of two prominent scholarly associations, the Society of Christian Ethics and the Catholic Theological Society of America. And this January, she will also receive the Society of Christian Ethics Lifetime Achievement Award. While Dr. Farley has cultivated a national and international reputation, and her 8 books cover a wide variety of topics ranging from metaphysics to embodiment to feminist hermeneutics, it's been her 2000 book, Just Love, a framework for Christian sexual ethics, that has arguably generated the most amount of public interest and commentary. Mind you, this is not primarily due to her receipt of the prestigious Grawemeyer Award in 2008 for having written the best book in religion. Rather, it's due to the stern notification that Just Love received in March 2012 by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and that's the Catholic body responsible for promulgating and defending Catholic doctrine. After an official examination, the CDF concluded that the teaching of Just Love manifests, quote, a defective understanding of the objective nature of natural moral law, end quote, and accordingly poses a, quote, grave harm to the faithful, end quote. The CDF also named the book's positions on masturbation, homosexual acts, homosexual unions, the indissolubility of marriage, and the problem of divorce and remarriage as specific problems that do not conform to Catholic teaching. As I understood the situation, the controversy surrounding her book produced 2 notable effects. The first is that the Vatican's concern sparked a wider discussion in the nation, particularly but not exclusively among Catholics, about gender and sexuality and taboo morality in particular, and quote-unquote radical feminist nuns, they wrote, in general, given extensive media coverage by the mainstream press and even late-night talk show hosts. So if you want a clever, albeit raunchy take on the issue, I encourage you to check out Stephen Colbert's little routine on the controversy. Okay. So the second effect, in my judgment, is that her book quickly became a bestseller. So it moved by one estimate from number 142,982 in Amazon sales to number 16 within a few days, and shot overnight to number 1 in the religion and spirituality category. Perhaps this was the upside of having one's work placed, as one might say, on the Vatican's naughty list. Farley's official response to the controversy, published a few months later in the National Catholic Reporter, reflected, again in my judgment, her characteristic wit and wisdom. She did not dispute the CDF's judgment that some of the positions contained within it, her book, are not in accord with current official Catholic teaching. Though she also took the occasion to clarify that her book was neither intended to express current official teaching, nor aimed specifically to combat it, or, to use her own words, it was of a different genre altogether. Dr. Farley's talk tonight is entitled Gender, Sexuality, and Ethics, New Perspectives. Beyond the narrow framing of questions and concerns, either by the Vatican or by the public at large about Farley's scholarship and books, I invite you all to listen to her broader framework for sexual ethics and the many reasons behind it. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Margaret Farley to the stage as this year's Pat A. Reif Memorial Lecturer.
Thank you very much, Grace, for your interesting introduction. After watching the video of the life and influence of Pat Reif, I am even more honored to be here this year as the lecturer in this long and illustrious series. I want to say I've never been to Claremont before, and I've experienced nothing but warm hospitality from the committee that organized it all, from the school and all of the students and others that I've met. And I am delighted to be present with you here this evening. In a way, the subject of my lecture this evening might be called Development of Doctrine, or development in religious and philosophical understandings and teachings regarding some aspects of human morality, in particular regarding morality and sexuality, or sexual ethics, how it has changed and can change, and what this means not only for individuals but society. I'll be focusing primarily on the Christian tradition of sexual ethics because of its massive influence on sexual ethics in Western culture and beyond. But I think that analogies might be drawn in at least some non-Western religious and philosophical traditions as well. Tonight I will simply try to do three things. First, provide a brief historical perspective on Western sexual ethics. Second, focus briefly on a specific question in contemporary sexual ethics. That is the question of same-sex relations as a case in point. Now, it may seem that, some people at least think since the Supreme Court decision and so on, that this is no longer an issue, etc. But on the ground, in our country and throughout the world, these issues still need to be addressed. And third, offer a framework for approaching sexual ethics today. So first, the historical perspective. The general history of ethical standards for sexual behavior in the West, at least as popularly understood, has been largely a history of unambiguous rules, or at least ideals. Although there have always been discrepancies between official rules and general practice, And although societies at different times and within different traditions have varied in their formulation of sexual ethical norms, yet in Western civilization there has at least appeared to be a fair degree of clarity and continuity in the guidelines governing our sexual lives. Today, however, nearly every traditional moral rule for sexual behavior has come under some kind of challenge. Long-standing prohibitions and positive obligations have become so problematic that individual nations and states debate legal changes. And religious traditions, as we know, struggle with new questions and increasingly controversial issues in this area. This shaking of the foundations, if you will, has not meant that we have today no concern for moral wisdom regarding sexual activity and relationships. Questions continue to be raised with growing urgency. Questions, for example, of how the human race should responsibly reproduce itself, how to eliminate destructive elements in sexual relationships, and how to integrate sexuality into the whole of human life. We are, for example, more concerned than ever before about sexual violence and abuse, the proliferation of sex industries, sexual harassment and gender domination, the breakdown of committed relationships, and our frequent powerlessness in a search for intimacy. In order to appreciate the changes that have taken place, however, it's helpful to recall historical Western, primarily Jewish and Christian traditions regarding sexual ethics. So first, regarding Judaism. Although there is some pessimism in the Hebrew Bible about the body as a hindrance to the life of the spirit, and some fear of sex as a form of defilement, overall, there is an affirmation of sex as a positive element in human life. Sexuality and sexual activity are considered natural, created by God, necessary for the flourishing of human persons, and even a religious imperative. Marriage is a religious duty affirmed by all the codes of Jewish law. Two elements in the historical Jewish concept of marriage have accounted for many of Judaism's major laws regarding sexuality. The first of these elements is the command to procreate, which is at the heart of the command to marry. The Jews had to build a people and sustain them. The second element is the patriarchal model upon which Hebrew Bible ideas of marriage and society were institutionally based. These two elements provided the rationale for prohibitions against adultery and regulations regarding divorce, prostitution, polygamous marriage, concubinage, and to some extent homosexuality, which was thought both to waste reproductive semen and to be demeaning to males insofar as it made one partner sexually passive, as it was thought, like women. Christianity emerged in the late Hellenistic age when even Judaism, with its strong positive valuation of marriage, sex, and procreation, was influenced by the pessimistic interpretation of sex and sexual passion taught by some versions of Greek philosophy. The Christian Testament, the New Testament, does not provide a systematic code of sexual ethics. A lot of people don't know that yet. The teachings of Jesus and his followers provide a central focus for the moral life in the command to love God and neighbor. Some fundamental virtues and ideals give general content to this command to love. Beyond this, the Christian scriptures value marriage and procreation on the one hand, and celibacy on the other. They affirm a sacred symbolic meaning for sexual intercourse, yet subordinated to other human values, and also find a possibility for evil within it. More specific guidelines appear in the New Testament only as responses to specific questions arising out of particular situations. As I'm sure you all know, these responses have been used to support varying positions, often opposing positions, regarding such issues as divorce and remarriage, the status and role of women, and homosexual activity. Like other religious traditions, Christian beliefs and teachings are complex, subject to outside influences, and capable of historical development. So within the Christian tradition, there are also two elements that have been particularly dominant: procreation as the purpose of sexual intercourse, and male-female complementarity as the essential model for sexual activity. Regarding the first of these elements, early Christian writers were profoundly influenced by some Greek philosophical theories that idealized human virtue in terms of reason controlling emotion, mind controlling body. Thus, Christian thinkers tended to affirm the goodness of sex because it is part of creation, but they were deeply suspicious of the power of sex to overwhelm the mind and to introduce disorder, as they thought, into personal and social lives. This disorder, believed to be based in sex as an indomitable biological and psychological drive, they judged to be the consequence of some kind of primordial sin, that is often called original sin, which had done catastrophic damage to creation. This disorder in sex, could be remedied in two ways, it was thought, although not directly cured. So it could be remedied first by bringing sex back into the order of reason by identifying for it a rational purpose, a rational goal for sexual desire. That is, of course, the purpose of procreation. Or second, by domesticating this seemingly otherwise uncontrollable drive within the institution of marriage. Both of these remedies led to the fundamental sexual rule: no sex outside of marriage. Only through marriage could there be adequate provision for the support of the offspring of sexual intercourse. And only in marriage, with its burdens of raising children and providing for family, could there be the so-called necessary taming of the sex drive. By and large, you'll have to excuse me, since I've arrived on the West Coast, I have some kind of a tickle in my throat, and I knew it was going to get me in a moment, so let me try to stave it off. By and large, in all Christian traditions, these concerns yielded a prevailing sexual ethic that was opposed to sex for its own sake, that is, for the sake only of sexual pleasure. Considering this inherently selfish and a distraction from contemplation of God and the fulfilling of human social responsibilities. I got plenty of water. Okay, just. Sorry, this is harder on you than it is on me, I know. A second element that has dominated Christian traditions is, as I said, that of male-female gender complementarity. This became even more important when the Protestant Reformation rejected celibacy as a viable option, assuming that all Christians, with few exceptions, would marry. But gender complementarity, of course, unfortunately, most of the time, turned out to mean male superiority and female subordination. The husband as head of the family, the wife as follower and helper. So that hierarchical gender relations were affirmed as the structural model for Christian family, church, and society. Although there were gradual cultural and religious shifts in understandings of marriage, sex, and love. For example, the tendency from the late Middle Ages on to begin to connect sex and marriage with romantic love rather than primarily with family arrangements and stability. This will go at some point. And the emergence of significant new insights regarding the importance of companionship between spouses. Nonetheless, it was only in the 20th century that most traditional sexual norms were seriously challenged. Some of the factors that accounted for the challenge were the development of technology that could assure the separation of sex from reproduction, in other words, more effective birth control. Cross-cultural studies that called into question many beliefs about what is natural to human beings. New understandings of sexuality and gender based on discoveries in biology, psychology, anthropology, and sociology, as well as philosophy and theology, that have yielded new understandings of sex and gender. Also, greater economic freedom for women and a new preoccupation with sex, not so much as a moral issue, but as both a question of health and a question of power relationships. As a result of these new learnings and new possibilities, the two dominant sexual motifs of the Christian tradition that I have identified have been, to an important extent, dislodged or at least relativized in general, but also within Christian thought itself. The procreative norm as the primary justification for sexual activity is largely gone. Moreover, rigid views of male-female complementarity have changed. That is, requirements for gender differentiation of roles have been softened. And you, well, folks, I could use a few prayers at this point. I don't want to lose my train of thought on your behalf by having to stop every minute. So let me see if I can stop this once and for all. The point I was trying to make, things have changed. We think differently about human sexuality. More specifically, on issues of contraception, and of divorce and remarriage. Protestant traditions changed dramatically in the 20th century, although questions of gender complementarity and same-sex relations continue to fracture some of the Protestant churches. And despite appearances to the contrary, major developments have taken place in Roman Catholic sexual ethics as well. This tradition, like every other, has been profoundly influenced by new interpretations of human sexuality. Changing patterns of relationship between women and men, and increased technological control of human fertility. In much of Catholic moral theology and ethics, the procreative norm as the sole or even primary justification for sexual activity is gone. Procreation is still extremely important as giving meaning to some sexual relations, but new understandings of the totality of the person support radically new concern for sexuality as an expression and a cause of love. The view of sexuality as fundamentally disordered, except when it is in the service of procreation, is therefore also gone from a great deal of Catholic thought. Although moral theologians still underline the potential that sex has for evil, as in sexual abuse, rape, harassment, exploitation, domination, betrayal, and so forth, the almost total suspicion of its destructive power has been seriously qualified. Moreover, rigid that might work better than the ones I'm using. You'll see. You can hear me with the in my cheek. One of my mottos for a long time that I heard from someone else, it's not original, is the great work of the church is never done under ideal circumstances. Moreover, rigid binary views of gender complementarity have changed in this tradition too. Equality and mutuality, shared possibilities and responsibilities are now advocated in Catholic as well as Protestant theologies of marriage and family. Still, of course, the primary motifs of a procreative norm and gender complementarity continue to appear in many official Catholic Church teachings, particularly regarding the use of contraceptives and the unchanging negative assessment of homosexual activity. Yet even in these official church teachings, there have been important changes. The Second Vatican Council undid the pride of place of procreation as the sole or primary purpose of marriage and sex. And despite the overall argument of Humanae Vitae, that was the document prohibiting birth control, the overall argument in that document, which included acceptance of natural family planning, opened room for responsible choices regarding reproduction. And although homosexual acts are still declared evil, homosexuals as such, that is, individuals who identify their sexual orientation as being toward those of the same sex, are not considered evil, and even homosexual acts may be good subjectively, if not objectively. But as I said before, these issues have not been laid to rest, and that's not just in the Catholic tradition. In fact, I'm sure you all know that leading up to the Supreme Court decision, all the polls showed that the religious denomination in this country, that more overwhelmingly were in favor of gay marriage was the Roman Catholic tradition. So I'm now turning to my second part, that is to say a few things about same-sex relations as a case in point for understanding development of doctrine. So long as the Christian tradition continued to justify sex primarily as a means for the procreation of children, or sex in marriage primarily as a correlative or as a corrective to disordered sexual desire, there was little room for any positive valuation of same-sex relationships and sexual activity. It would seem to follow, therefore, that when these perspectives were modified, a new and more positive Christian position on gay and lesbian relationships would emerge. This has happened for many, though of course not all, of the faithful and clergy, and in the writings of many Christian ethicists, but not as yet in some official church teaching. I'm trying to do a logic here. For example, despite the important shifts that I've just described in the Roman Catholic and other traditions, there is minimal change in official teachings regarding homosexuality. This is true of some Protestant traditions as well. The procreative norm has been relativized for heterosexual relations, but it returns when arguments against homosexual relations are at issue. The view of sexuality as fundamentally disordered is gone for heterosexual sex, but it reappears as strong as ever in some judgments about gay and lesbian sex. Rigid stereotypes of male-female complementarity are softened for general social roles, but the importance of gender complementarity still becomes, for some persons, the final strike against the acceptance of same-sex relations. How might we adjudicate the current ongoing debates on these issues? What insights are important in discerning, both as individuals and as members of church communities, how to think about these matters? When Christians look for light on any ethical question, they turn to basic sources: Scripture, tradition in the sense of the history of Christian belief, discernible in the teachings and practices of the church and in the history of Christian theology, secular disciplines of knowledge, in this case, for example, philosophy and the biological and behavioral sciences, and fourth, contemporary experience. In the time I have this evening, I can't rehearse the multiple findings and interpretations that scholars now provide for these sources, but let me touch on them briefly. First, regarding the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, particular texts on homosexuality, as countless biblical scholars have shown, all offer problems for both exegesis and interpretation. Whether because of ambiguity in the case of rhetorical devices in biblical texts, or disparity between the meaning of homosexuality in biblical times and now. For example, when biblical texts were written, there was no concept of sexual orientation or of long-term committed same-sex relationship. Didn't exist. What they were opposed to was men, basically, who were assumed to be heterosexual, having such an indomitable drive that they had to have it with anybody. We can enter the battle of proof texts and diverse interpretations on either side, or we can stand before the biblical revelation as a whole. Either way, it seems to me that a modest conclusion is warranted. That is, that the biblical witness does not offer incontrovertible grounds for an absolute prohibition or a comprehensive blessing for same-sex relations. Second, the Christian tradition, too, requires exegesis and interpretation. We can find it in occasional past absolute prohibitions of same-sex relations, but these are not consistent throughout the tradition. And where they are based on rationales that no longer appear persuasive to anybody. For example, that homosexuality is unnatural in humans because it's unnatural in animals. We know better. Hence, the rationales, at least, have been widely abandoned or changed. Those who want to perpetuate the prohibitions because of an interpretation of the tradition have to find new rationales. Another modest conclusion can therefore be drawn. Just as it is certainly not possible to draw from the tradition at this point a comprehensive blessing on all same-sex relations, so it is not possible to draw an absolute prohibition. From secular disciplines, for example, genetics, philosophy, anthropology, psychology, medicine, there is also too much disagreement to yield a final word for everyone in our discernment, although these disciplines largely lean in directions that presume that there is nothing about same-sex relationship as such that harms people, at least not in societies that don't already have harmful bias and discrimination. What we have learned regard, for example, the inadequacy and inaccuracy of stereotypical differentiation of gender characteristics, the injustice of rigid gender role differentiation, the harms imposed on those whose gender is ambiguous, and so forth, at least gives us grounds to oppose discrimination against any people on basis of gender or sexual orientation, and to support their full incorporation into our human communities. The fourth and last of the traditional sources for moral insight on moral questions is that of contemporary experience. Sometimes it's called the work of the Spirit in our own times. In regard to same-sex relationships, we have important voices to be listened to. That is, we do have available the testimony of women and men whose sexual experiences with others of the same sex. By itself, experience does not provide an incontestable foundational deposit of insight. It cannot be used to establish an anything goes conclusion based on any and all experience. But for some ethical questions, it is a primary source, able to be tested in significant ways. For example, in terms of the integrity of those whose experience is being shared. Same-sex relations today presents one of these questions. All of this leads me to conclude that we need to change the question commonly asked in sexual ethics about same-sex relationships. What we should be asking is not whether same-sex relations can be morally justified, but rather when they can, not whether, but when they can be justified. That is, under what conditions, according to what ethical criteria, will same-sex relationships be morally good? This is, of course, the same question we must ask about heterosexual relations. I turn then to my third consideration this evening. Is there a framework for contemporary Christian or contemporary human sexual ethics that will help us to discern questions such as this one, as well as many others? A framework that will assist us in discerning when any sexual relationship or activity is appropriate and morally good. So my third section, I need Diane to help me. James, sorry. As I begin to outline a possible framework for sexual ethics, I'm reminded of something that the philosopher Paul Ricoeur said in his early work in a book entitled Symbolism of Evil. He was trying to sort of describe what symbols we use in Western civilization through time that symbolize precisely moral evil. He identifies 3 moments or stages in the way that Western civilization has symbolized moral evil. The first he calls defilement. The second he calls sin. And the third he names guilt. Now in his sense, defilement as a symbol refers to an experience of evil when we have broken a taboo. But taboos are by definition pre-ethical, irrational, quasi-material. Something infects by contact, leaves a symbolic stain. Sin, in Ricoeur's sense, is a symbol for moral evil when we understand it as a breakdown in a relationship. And guilt, for Ricoeur in this context, refers to an understanding of evil wherein the breakdown of relationship is seen as the result of my free choice. What does any of this have to do with sexuality? Ricoeur observes that although we no longer think in general of moral evil primarily in terms of defilement, yet in the sexual sphere, the tendency to equate sexuality with defilement clings to our collective psyche, our collective unconscious. In other words, the sense of defilement is not easily left behind. And an inarticulable but persistent tie between sexuality and evil remains deep in the symbol structure of the West. Now, you may say, oh no, not anymore. We've gotten rid of all of that. Well, then how come so much stigma about sexual addiction? How much stigma about politicians who do terrible things to harm people, but the only thing that really looks evil that they do is their dalliances in adulterous relationships. You could give example after example, and I don't think it's just in the West, because missionaries have been everywhere. And why the efforts to criminalize anybody associated with same-sex relationships in some African countries, for example. Thus, the necessary step in the formulation of a contemporary sexual ethic must be to move sexuality more completely from the realm of the pre-ethical to the ethical. The blind sense of defilement must be subjected to relentless criticism and responsible repudiation. A sexual ethic may be achieved not solely from thinking about sexuality, but by turning first to the non-sexual spheres of human existence, to the spheres of work, economics, politics, to discern what justice means in human relationships. Then we may be capable of turning back to ask what justice must mean in the sphere of our sexuality. This kind of analysis, just suggested in passing by Ricoeur, he never made it, and it's beyond the scope of our considerations together here. But I nonetheless want to ask what a justice ethic for sexual relations might entail. This may prove to be only preliminary to a more adequate sexual ethics, but it has the advantage of moving sexuality away from a taboo morality without assuming a contentless ethic of love. It will not do, as some wish, to end all ethical discernment by simply saying that sexual relations and activities are good when they express love. For love is the problem in ethics, not the solution. There are wise loves and foolish, good loves and bad, true loves and mistaken loves. The question ultimately is, what is a right love, a good love? The articulation of norms of justice may begin to help us answer this question. For these will be the norms of a just love, that is, of love that is shaped by justice. Justice, of course, can mean many things. My use of it here is based simply on a fundamental formal meaning, to render to each his or her due. This translates into the fundamental principle that persons and groups of persons ought to be affirmed according to their deepest concrete reality, actual and potential. The formulation of specific principles of justice depends then on our interpretation of the reality of persons. I begin with what are perhaps abstract considerations, but also concrete, as I hope will become clear. For example, contemporary concern for understanding, at least in the West, what it means to be a person can lead us to focus on at least two aspects of human persons. One is sometimes called autonomy, but I think better called capacity for self-determination, the capacity for free choice, and the other is our equally deep capacity for what I call relationality. Relationality. These two features ground an obligation to respect persons as ends in themselves and forbid the use of persons as pure or mere means. Now, I know this, I'm going very quickly over something that is essential to what I ultimately want to offer, but let me just try to put it in a few words. Why is self-determination so deep within us? And why can or how can it be violated? Well, it is, I mean, whether you believe in free choice or not, in some way we consider some of our actions as our own actions. We believe, in some sense, we have the capacity to determine our own destiny, within limits, of course, our own ends. We have the capacity to set our own agenda. And if I violate your agenda and scoop it into my agenda, I am violating who you are. Now, all the questions around, well, what's not a good agenda, etc. I'm just saying, generally speaking, we get to determine who we will become. And relationality, a capacity, what is that? It's a capacity to come into union with all that is knowable and lovable. A capacity to love and be loved and accept love. A capacity whereby by loving we come to be in one another, but we're still in ourselves. That is at the depths of what it means to be a person. Together these two, and I don't claim to have convinced you of anything, but I'm just laying it out. And I could try to convince you, so. These two features ground an obligation to respect persons. That's what human dignity means. Respect persons. They yield what I describe, or can yield at least, 7 more specific norms in the sexual sphere. And now I'm going to give those norms as succinctly as I can. I'll make one comment about them to begin with. As you will see as we go through each of them, they are not all mutually exclusive. Some of them cover similar possibilities. They also all pretty much admit to degrees. Although they are not simply ideals, they are in an important sense bottom line requirements. And they all point to significant considerations that must be taken into account. So, the first of my 7 norms. The first of these norms or principles of sexual ethics is based on the obligation to respect persons. So it's derived from both of these features of what it means to be a person, both capacity for self-determination and for relationality. That's what grounds fundamental respect in the deep reality of persons as both autonomous and relational ends in themselves. The first principle is do no unjust harm. Do not harm echoes through the experience of the command do not kill. In the sexual sphere, there are many forms that harm can take. Physical, psychological, spiritual, relational. Here, each person is vulnerable in ways that can go deep within. As inspirited bodies, embodied spirits, we are vulnerable to sexual exploitation, battery, enslavement, negligence, and to deceit, betrayal, being shamed, stigmatized, barred from human community by exclusionary practices of gender. Do no unjust harm goes a long way towards specifying a sexual ethic, but not far enough. We need additional norms or principles in order to specify more clearly what doing no harm means. Hence, my second sexual ethical norm, based on which I'm drawing directly from the obligation to respect the autonomy, the freedom of persons, that is their capacity for self-determination, sets a minimum but absolute requirement for the free consent of sexual partners. Now you could say, well, what's new about that? Well, those were not the beginning norms in sexual ethics through centuries. This means, of course, that rape, violence, or any harmful use of power against unwilling victims is never justified. And seduction or manipulation of persons who have limited capacity for choice because of age or immaturity, special dependency, or loss of ordinary power is ruled out. In requiring respect for the choice of each partner, this norm requires respect for bodily integrity. It opposes sexual harassment, pedophilia, and other instances of the violation of persons. It also means that other ethical principles, such as principles of truth-telling and promise-keeping, are fundamental to an adequate sexual ethics. Why is that under free consent? Well, these principles can mean many things, but one of them is, for example, if I lie to you in our relationship, in order to manipulate you, and you believe me, I have deceived you. I have limited your options. The same is true if I make a promise to you. Now, we make lots of promises that we are not able to keep. I'm not talking about those. But we make promises intentionally knowing that we will not keep it. We again limit your options because we trust what the promise is. Whatever other rationales can be given for these principles, their violation hinders the freedom of choice of the other person. Deception and betrayal are ultimately coercive. Relationality. Now, I'm serious. So we have free consent. So now I've drawn the do no harm for both aspects of persons to be respected. Drawn the free consent from the self-determination. Now I'm going to take the rest of my norms derived from the aspect of relationality. Relationality is equally primordial with autonomy as a feature of human personhood. whoever gave me that wonderful lozenge, which worked better than mine, this one's going down. I could use another.
If we go to number 3, I can go get more. You ready?
Not yet. Just one sec. We're all friends, right? Relationality is equiproportional autonomy. Okay. Individuals do not just survive or thrive in relation to others. They cannot exist without some form of fundamental relatedness to personal others. Now, sexual activity and sexual pleasure are instruments and modes of relation, including relation to self. They can enhance relation or hinder it, contribute to it and express it or distort it. They are optional goods in the sense that they are not absolute, peremptory goods which could never be subordinated to other goods or for the sake of other goods be let go, but they are very great goods mediating relationality and the general well-being of persons. Insofar as one person is sexually active in relation to another, sex must not violate relationality, but serve it. Another way of saying this is that it is not enough, either in a general sense, not to harm sexual partners, or even more specifically, to respect the free choice of sexual partners. We need further sexual norms. My third norm is mutuality. Respect for persons together in sexual activity requires mutuality of participation. This, of course, can be expressed in many ways, but it entails activity and receptivity on the part of both persons, not one being active and the other passive. For centuries, that was the accepted model for sexual relations. Today, we would call it rape. So not being active, one active and the other passive, but mutuality of desire, of action, and of response. I'll recall I said there are degrees. There's not total mutuality. There's probably never a total free choice either, but at a certain point you cross a threshold where it becomes destructive. This leads to yet another norm. Freedom and mutuality are not sufficient to respect persons in sexual relationships. A condition for real freedom and a necessary qualification of mutuality is equality, my fourth norm. The equality that is at stake here is equality of power. Major inequities in social and economic status, age and maturity, professional identity, and so forth, can render sexual relations inappropriate and unethical, primarily because they entail power inequalities. Hence, unequal vulnerability, dependency, and limitation of options. The requirement for equality rules out treating a partner as property, as a commodity, as an element in market exchange, as a mere instrument for one's own pleasure. Strong arguments can be made for another, a fifth norm, specifying respect for relationality. This is a norm of commitment. So it's one of the hardest norms in our day. But I want to say something a little bit more about what I mean by that. At the heart of the Christian community's understanding of the place of sexuality in human and Christian life has been the notion that some form of commitment, some form of covenant, must characterize relations that include a sexual dimension. In the past, this commitment, of course, was identified only with heterosexual marriage. It was tied to the need for a procreative order and a discipline for unruly sex, even when it was valued in itself as a realization of the life of the church in relation to Jesus Christ. It carried what today are unwanted connotations of inequality in relations between men and women. It is possible, nonetheless, that when all the meanings of commitment for sexual relations are sifted, we are left with powerful reasons to retain some form of commitment as an ethical norm. Why? Well, at first, there's an obvious reason. It helps to protect the vulnerability of each partner. They can count on one another. But there is another reason as well. Contemporary understandings of sexuality point to different possibilities for sex than may have been central in the past. That is the possibility of growth in the human person, the gathering of creative energies, the integration of the person, and the realization of these possibilities precisely through commitment, including sexual commitment. One of the central insights from contemporary ethical reflection on sexuality is that norms of sexual justice cannot have as their whole goal to set limits to the power and expression of human sexuality. Sexuality needs to be nurtured, sustained, as well as disciplined, channeled, controlled. No, it used to be, it's easier, I suppose, in another era to think of sex as just this indomitable drive that we need to discipline. Today, more complaints arise, not because the drive is so great, but because it's worn out. There is the problem of the waning of desire and love in any relationship. Commitment, rather than contributing to that, has the potential to sustain desire and love. One way to do this is to extend a human relationship sufficiently through time to allow the incorporation of sexuality into a shared life and an enduring love. Sometimes this is just pie in the sky. It just doesn't work. But sometimes it works. At the very least, it may be said that while brief encounters may open a lover to relation, they cannot mediate the kind of union of knowing and being known, loving and being loved, for which human relationality offers the potential. What commitment can do for a relationship is to give it a future and a past, a time between in which it can learn the ways of trust, faithfulness, forgiveness, and hope. A sexual ethic, then, may importantly identify at least some form of commitment as a norm for sexual relations and activity. Given a concern for wholeness, for nurturing sexual desire and love into a tenderness that has not forgotten passion, for aspiring to the highest forms of friendship, the norm seems to be a committed love. A sixth norm, derivative also from my understanding of relationality, is what I call fruitfulness. While the traditional procreative norm of sexual relations and activity no longer holds absolute sway in sexual ethics, there remains, of course, special concern for responsible reproduction of the human species, that is, biological reproduction. But beyond, and even apart from, the kind of fruitfulness that brings forth biological children, there is a kind of fruitfulness that is a measure, perhaps, of all interpersonal love. Love between persons violates relationality if it closes in upon itself and refuses to open to a wider community of persons, if it becomes just for the two of us, or what the French would say, égoïsme en Dieu. But the new life within it, that love, may move beyond it in countless forms, not just having children. For example, nourishing other relationships, providing goods and services for others, informing the work lives of the partners in relation, caring for other people's biological children, fostering beauty in the world and justice in human relationships. All of these forms can be understood as the fruit of a love for which the persons in relation are responsible. The articulation of this norm moves us to another perspective in the development of sexual ethic and to my final seventh norm, which I call social justice. There are obligations in justice which others in the community and the wider society have toward persons as sexual beings. The other norms have to do with individual relations, basically. This has to do with social justice. Whether persons are single or married, gay or straight, bisexual or transgender, they have claims to respect from faith communities as well as the wider society. Claims to equal protection under the law, to self-determination, to a share in the goods and services needed by all. Their needs for incorporation into the community, for psychic security and basic well-being, make the same claims for social cooperation among us as do those of us all. This last norm, in other words, obligates not only individuals in a relationship, but wider communities and societies. I've started writing more about that, etc., but I don't have time for that today. But in conclusion, what I have tried to offer here is a framework for sexual ethics based on norms of justice. Those norms which govern all human relationships and those which are particular to the intimacy of sexual relations. Christians and others, no doubt, may want to specify more fully such norms as faithfulness, forgiveness, patience, and hope, which are essential for relationships between persons, at least to some degree, and especially within faith communities and in experienced relationship with God. If I may for just one moment return to the question of gay and lesbian relations, let me say this. What I am suggesting is that these norms, or ethical principles for a just love in sexual relations, are the same norms for heterosexual and for homosexual relations. Neither neither particular heterosexual nor particular same-sex relations can be automatically justified or condemned. Both have criteria for moral justification. And as far as I can see, these criteria, these norms, are the same for both. More specifically, we can say that sex between two persons of the same sex, just as between two persons of the so-called opposite sex, should not be used in a way that harms, exploits, objectifies or dominates one's partner. Freedom and integrity are values to be affirmed in every same-sex as heterosex relationship, as are the values of mutuality, equality, commitment, and fruitfulness. This leads also to the conclusion that just as gays and lesbians can and must claim social justice from their society in terms of non-discrimination in employment, housing, etc., and security against violent attack or prejudice to their participation in society's organization, so gays and lesbians can claim justice from their churches in support of themselves and their efforts of commitment. They can be faithful, fair, truthful, and sharers in the life of grace, with a right to the treasures of revelation, the good news of divine revelation, and the sacred rituals that will help them to sustain their relationships and their lives. It is not an easy task to introduce considerations of justice into every sexual relation and the evaluation of every sexual activity. Critical questions remain unanswered, and serious disagreements are all too frequent regarding the concrete reality of persons and the meaning of sexuality. What is harmful and what is helpful to individual persons and societies is not always clear. What can be normative and what exceptional is sometimes a matter of all too delicate judgment. But if sexuality is to be creative and not destructive in personal and social relationships, then there is no substitute for discerning ever more carefully the norms whereby it will be just. Thank you.
So if anybody has any questions, and please be compassionate in the fact that she has a voice, her voice is problematic. So if anybody has any questions.
Or objections, or
comments, or
whatever. Yes.
This
They're on?
Just making sure they're on.
Oh, okay. Go to what? There's a mic to go to.
There's a mic on either side. There's a mic on either side. So.
So I know that. So as we talked earlier over in the dinner gathering, I know so much of your work has been so focused around LGBTQ issues, and so much appreciation, is warranted and deserved for that. And I don't want to take away a thing at all from that, but I'm just noticing that as we are moving toward greater justice in same-sex relationships, there's, within the church, there's still a bias against single people. And there's still an assumption that everyone will get married. And, in fact, I'm going through the process of looking at postings for teaching jobs. And there was one at an institution of higher learning that was affiliated with the Quaker faith that indicated anyone who was hired would need to sign their value statement that allowed only sexual relationships within marriage. And so I have, from when I was a teenager, yearned to be married, and it has never happened for me. I am 55 now, and no institution is going to tell me, what and what I can't do. So I don't have any doubt about my own determination there. But I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about when is it going to be time for single people within the church to, for there to be a sense of healthy sexuality that allows for expression within a single life.
Thank you. That's an excellent question and a difficult one to respond to. But you notice in what I've said tonight, and if you read my book that expands on all of this a lot, I have never limited the focus to already institutionalized forms, because everything is in flux. I mean, you can ask, where are the churches now? They don't talk about it, but where are they? They know that a significant number of their congregants are living together without whatever. And the question is the same as if someone is single but has a profound or a good relationship. Is it no sex outside of marriage still? Or is it not? My very leaving that question open is to provide a framework to think about that question as well as the others. I'm not advocating anything. I'm saying so much has become a whole new ballgame. This, how many people, what about the people who cohabit, sometimes forever, intentionally, sometimes ultimately marry, maybe not. The point is not that we want to loosen our sexual norms and so on, and that's why we have these rules and the institutions. Things have changed. And I don't want to say they've changed, we're less moral than we used to be, so we'll have to put up with it. I don't see it that way. We know more than we did before. We still make huge mistakes, but we know more. And in the light of that knowledge, I'm trying to say it's not anything goes, but it's also not just the same rules in the same way that have always been. It's a creative challenge. And people have to think through their own lives. Maybe they have to think together in different ways so that there comes to be a growing communal understanding of what's destructive and what's creative, of what is good before God and what is less good, etc. So I thank you for the question. I'm sure I'm not shedding light on it, but that's where I think we are at this point. Yes?
Thank you. I've taught your seminars for Just Love for the last several years to group of undergraduates, freshmen actually in college. And it is, I think, for some of them been absolutely life-changing. And so I was just wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit about how your time at Yale, working with the undergrads at Yale, perhaps shaped some of your thinking around the necessity of having a sexual ethic that is normed and brought into an ethical realm, rather than, as you were saying, the sort of taboo mentality.
Well, strangely enough, I hear again and again across the country, and even across to other countries, that young people really like the framework. Now, you could say, well, it gives them, but it isn't. I mean, I've said these are not just ideals. There are aspects of them that are bottom line requirements. And they apparently get that too. Now, I can't tell you about Yale undergraduates because I only taught graduate students for almost 40 years. But, you know, first year MBA students are about the same as undergraduate students. My goal is to help us think about these issues. It isn't to lay out here are the answers and the solution. To think. I only articulated this after one time I was giving a workshop and a couple of people stood up and one said, well, I have teenagers and I don't think they're going to be able to understand this. And then someone else stood up and said, well, I was in another workshop. She was in another workshop. She said, I went home and I took that framework, those norms, and I pasted it on the mirror in the bathroom. And my kids, and we never could really talk about things, but my kids had to face those every time, or in every bathroom, or whatever, I don't know. But she felt that it was a great help for her in working with her children. Now, I think her children were teenagers, not necessarily college students. I hope it helps. And then that same workshop, another one stood up and said, is it what you're trying to do is make us think? And it was the greatest compliment I ever had. So. It isn't something that shuts it down. I mean, because young people are in between now. No norms. I hate norms. All those norms, they don't work. And look at what's happening, and so on. And it's we're free spirits, etc. And between too many norms, too rigid norms, and anything goes. They want something of substance as alternatives to either of those. I certainly don't claim to have that last word on all of this, or even on the pedagogy that works well or not. But I have been actually astonished to hear primarily from teachers of undergraduates how important it is to those students. Now, do I know in depth how it's important on their ongoing lives? At least they have something to think about. But thank you for teaching it. Yes.
Hi. I don't like any of those norms either, and I'm not a young person anymore.
You look pretty young to me.
My question has to do with the idea that you get married for love and you get married for life, maybe when you're younger. I've been divorced twice and now I'm single, and so thinking in the context of relationships in the 21st century and how confusing that has become, I'm wondering if you talked about the creative challenge. And so I'm wondering, with society being so unhelpful with relationships, married or just committed relationships, even heterosexual relationships, and how much more so for relationships that are in the LGBTQ community. I wonder, with churches requiring, I went through my second divorce while serving a local church as the pastor, and lots of contradictions with that, and lots of baggage. So what you do is you quit and you go to seminary. But I'm wondering if the simple way to say this is, do we believe that marriage itself is still important to God? Are we placing too much value on the institution of marriage, or are we just in a time of confusion, a time for pondering and wondering what marriage really means? Because I feel like it might actually mean something different now than it did in the past, but we are searching for what that meaning is. So it causes an attitude of tension and insecurity, so a place where you'd rather not go. That's basically it.
I guess I would say yes to all of that.
That's not helpful.
Well, I'll take the central question. Is marriage, in some kind of traditional sense anyway, pleasing to God? Well, I mean, number one, I would say clearly. But we have all the other questions. Are other forms of relationship also pleasing to God? But in each case, this framework is, if one thought through a potential relationship or a long-term relationship, but that could use a little more wisdom, all of the issues that could be raised in relation to these norms or principles. If we do it, if we think about it as genuinely as we can, it seems to me insights come as to, does this look pleasing to God or does it not? I mean, I don't like just asking that question. It seems like a judgment question, but a genuine question. I mean, there are all kinds of ways of asking it, which is, why would it be pleasing to God? Is it because God is afraid we're having too much sex? Or is it because Unfortunately, we're not having so much sex because we're all tired from raising children, or is where's what? We don't know the answer to what's the best way to raise children, even in context. We know experiments that have been made and so on. None of them seem to have a complete solution. Different societies and different cultures have tried different ways of cohabiting or being married, or and it usually surprises people. But the truth is, the by and large, by a great margin, still in our world, the majority of marriages are polygamous marriages. I mean, that's, to us who live in Western culture, and we try to put it on people in other continents and countries. What was so wrong about that? Well, I would have worked a lot over 13 years in Africa. I would never advocate polygamy, for example, because women are rising up in all those countries, and they don't like it. And they feel that I could describe, they have proverbs that are so poignant, So, but on the other hand, did it fulfill a purpose at a certain point in time? Augustine thought it did, because all the prophets and patriarchs, they were all polygamists, etc. We have to sort of start over and say, what is it that we want and need in a culture, in a society? Life is hard for everybody. We need to help one another. And that help comes in relationships of many kinds, not all sexual, but what works and what doesn't. I've been asked to talk on marriage and family a number of times, and I'm always hesitant because I think today we have many forms of marriage and many forms of family. The great criteria is what works. Now, we haven't thought it through enough, we haven't shared experiences enough, we haven't been honest about contradictions and so on, but there are practical answers. There's no perfect way of living in relation. But some ways are better than others. And they have to do with being non-destructive and being truly caring, even though we're not very wise about our caring all the time, etc., etc. We can do that. And I think churches are, if we can get through the fear, I think some people suffer from their own consciences in a way. I think leaders in the church sometimes do. Well, it has to do with sexuality. Oh my gosh, who am I to say we can change this from centuries and so on? Well, but what are we doing that really helps? So, again, I don't have a formula to answer your question. I just think we are better able to think through things. And if we can help each other do it, so much the better.
We're running out of time, and we want to give Margaret a chance to sign some books out in the lobby, and they are available to buy. We have 4 different books, and maybe you can continue your questions if she's willing to talk out there. So please let me thank Margaret again. Help me thank her again for being here. For all your